Take a listen, 0.1%. That is how much countries in East and Horn of Africa contribute to global emissions. And yet, the region bears the heaviest brunt of climate change. We faced 4 back-to-back failed rainy seasons and the worst drought in 40 years as a result.
At least 36.1 million people have been affected by the drought and 8.9 million livestock have died. Now, more than ever, we can say that climate change is a crucial driver of internal and cross-border migration and displacement. In fact, the World Bank predicts there will be up to 85.7 million climate migrants in sub-Saharan Africa by 2015. Well, Amy Pope, the new Director General for the International Organization for Migration, made her first visit to the region and sat down with us while here in Kenya this week. She began by painting a picture of the impact of climate change on migration patterns in the region.
The impact of climate change is extraordinary. There have been over 25 million people who've been displaced by climate just in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And you look at what is happening in terms of communities that are living very much off of the land. So farmers, pastoralists, people who are reliant on fishing, and the impact of climate on those communities is extraordinary. It deprives them of their livelihoods. It leaves them, in some cases, starving with no other options but to move. I saw it firsthand. I was in Dadaab just a few weeks ago while I was here for the African Climate Summit. And there, as you know, it's one of the biggest refugee camps in Africa. But over 100,000 people had come from Somalia over the last couple of years as a result of the drought. And in some cases, refugees who had been resettled home back to Somalia came back to Kenya because of the impact of the drought. And so the impact on the region is stark. We're seeing millions of people, over 3 million displaced just in Somalia alone. You magnify that by what's happening in Ethiopia, here in Kenya itself, and we know that the impact on people is really, it's beyond anything that anyone could really have imagined.
Of course, some Somalis who went back home came back to Kenya. Oftentimes they're finding resource-constrained communities that can't sustain them. So how do you kind of help build up their capacity if they have to go back home?
So, number one, we need to acknowledge that climate is displacing people, and the international community has been slow to do that. I'll start with the fact that President Ruto is leading on this issue. The fact that he brought countries together to acknowledge the impact of climate on this continent is key. Admitting that there's a problem is our first step. But then we need to build resilience. So in some cases, it's looking at better water management. In some cases, it means enabling communities to develop new skills so that if they can no longer farm or fish or feed their livestock, they have opportunities. In other cases, in all cases, it means involving other partners. So it cannot just be governments, it cannot just be international organizations. We need the private sector to be part of the solution. We need community organizations.
Would you say this is almost like the beacon of hope, that this is how it's supposed to be done?
What we see in Kenya is far more stability, and that is part of what attracts people. The Somalis that I spoke to, for example, were dealing not only with the impact of drought, but they were in communities that were already destabilized as a result of conflict. So people are seeking safety. And what is key here about what's happening in Kenya is that there's the building of resilience so that as climate shocks happen, communities are better able to respond. Without that, we really, people have nothing left but to move. And I think what Kenya is doing in building the awareness, in building the commitment to a much more strategic approach, in bringing other partners online to do so, that's absolutely critical.
In terms of sustainability, because global aid agencies can't be here forever, so how do we start putting in those structures?
It starts with enabling the livelihoods. So recognizing in advance if a community is drought prone and it's a primarily agricultural community, we need to identify new skills for the young people of today so they can get the jobs of tomorrow. That's number one. It's also recognizing that we need to use migration as a strategic way of helping communities adapt. So if a person can no longer work in a certain part of the country and their job opportunities will be elsewhere because of climate change, let's enable that movement in a much more planned and strategic fashion. The truth is, people are going to move if they cannot find a living, right? If they cannot make a living or feed their children. So let's engage in a more strategic approach to their movements. So it's not done chaotically, it's not done out of desperation, and it doesn't burden the communities who end up hosting them.
What would you say is a bigger factor in terms of seeing more people leave their homes, climate or conflict?
Well, the numbers show that it's actually climate. Now, you have to look at it. Climate on top of conflict is particularly destabilizing. So that combination is one of the most significant that we see across the continent. But climate by itself is a major driver, especially because it fuels economic insecurity. So we see as many as 80% of people moving across the continent as a result of economic drivers. But you peel back what is causing the economic disparity, you find more climate change than anything.
Thank you so much, Madam G.
It's a pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.